Governor Ron DeSantis, late last week, made it clear he's sending help, boots on the ground, to help his fellow Republican and Texas governor fight illegal immigration at the southern border. It's a hot-button issue, and Forrest Saunders again with our story.
Governor Ron DeSantis in Jacksonville Thursday announcing his latest headline grab.
We need to stop this invasion at our southern border once and for all.
The Republican deploying up to 1,000 members of the Florida National Guard.
Red tent. Go to the red tent.
And the state's reincarnated civilian force, the Florida State Guard. Troops headed to Texas.
And the goal is to help Texas fortify this border, help them strengthen the barricades, help them add barriers, help them add the wire that they need to so that we can stop this invasion once and for all.
It comes as the Lone Star State squares off with the Biden administration and federal border officials at Eagle Pass. The U.S. Supreme Court recently ruled hazardous razor wire Texas officials installed there needed to come down. Texas Governor Greg Abbott vowing to defy that order, promising to rebuild whatever is removed, and DeSantis vowing to help.
What the governor is saying is that we're being invaded, and I agree with him. We are being invaded.
Florida Republicans like State Senator Blaise Ingoglia hailed the deployment. The escalation, he felt, would force courts to resolve a simmering dispute over federal immigration issues and a state's power to defend itself.
We're clearly being invaded, and when you have 3,000 people in a month coming across the border, I would ask people, what would you call that?
Florida Democrats, on the other hand, fired back later in the day. The state party called the effort, quote, another political stunt with a heavy price tag for taxpayers.
The men and women of the State Guard and certainly the National Guard did not sign up to be used as political stunts, and that's clearly what this is.
The Florida House Minority Leader didn't pull punches either, saying DeSantis needed to stop his now defunct run for president and just run the state.
Leadership requires courage, it requires conviction, it requires making tough choices, but it also requires doing your damn job. And right now, DeSantis is not doing his.
Now, Democrats are also questioning whether or not the State Guard can even be used in this capacity to help secure the southern border. You might remember the force was reincarnated a couple of years ago, originally to help out with natural disasters, things like hurricanes and other states of emergency. Well, the governor's office noting on Thursday that Florida still has a state of emergency in effect for migrants, and that is after we saw a bunch of landings in the Florida Keys in January of 2023. That's the latest out here at the state capitol. I'm Forrest Saunders reporting.
Prudent policy, political stunt, something in between. Joined by a longtime familiar face around these parts. To the point, Dr. Kevin Wagner, FAU political science professor. Appreciate you being with us. Unpack it. Where on the spectrum, as you talk to our viewers, should we analyze this?
Can it be all of those? At the end of the day, one of the things that is true, if you check public opinion, not only in the state of Florida, but nationally, is that Americans are concerned about immigration. They're concerned about the border. They're concerned about the numbers at the border. And I think you can see both parties are trying to figure out how to address that in ways that are both lawful but appropriate for where they are. Talk about that as an issue as we head to November. How much is immigration skyrocketing for now to a top of the list as you look at a prospective Biden-Trump rematch? So typically in a national election, the number one issue is always the state of the economy or perception of the state of the economy. That's usually when you do models of how people are going to vote. That's usually what you do. Currently, when we're looking at the national polls, immigration is really rising to the top. Whether it will be there in November or not, I don't know. But I think it's clearly one of those issues that has an ability to drive voters. It has an ability to get voters to the polls, and it's certainly one of those issues that I think people are going to still be paying attention to. How worried should Democrats and the president be with the polling that you're seeing right now, vis-a-vis his positions, perceived or real, and the positions perceived or real of his, again, prospective likely opponent, the former President Donald Trump? I think if I were the Biden administration or working on the Biden campaign, I'd be very concerned, because it's pretty clear this is not just an issue that has Americans' concerns, it's cross-cutting. You see significant numbers of Democrats also concerned about the border as well. He can make the argument that this is something that's existed prior to him, that these kinds of things move in cycles, that the problem is really legislation in Congress, all of these kind of technical policy kind of arguments. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the president is often held responsible, and right now people are concerned about the border. Talk about the history here. It's been 1986. Ronald Reagan was in his second term of office as President of the United States when we last had comprehensive immigration reform. It's a hot-button issue that remains, and yet both sides are blamed for really
making it more politics than policy. How have we gotten to this spot, and why are we mired in it? What's the history of it? What's the perspective?
Yeah, well, we could do a whole show on the history.
a lot of broadcasts on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty long time. I mean, if you go back far enough, we didn't have immigration policy. Immigration policy is a function of a more modern state. So,
back to when? What?
Yeah, you could go back to the 19th century when you had things like the Chinese Exclusion Act. It wasn't until the 1920s where we started to do sort of quota based on ethnicity and region that you were importing from, or you were coming from. And then, of course, there was the post-World War II reforms that tried to do away with some of the sort of negative ways that we did these, including trying to treat, one of the cornerstones of international law is that when somebody comes as a refugee to a nation, you're supposed to not just return them, you're supposed to give them a hearing and check to see whether or not they have a valid refugee status. And I think that's part of what is the issue today, which is if you take the time to do that and so many people are coming, you need the resources to be able to do it efficiently.
Are we able to get out of the muddle and the polarization of our politics anymore to really handle big, tough issues like this? A lot of people worry we're not just on immigration, but on a whole host of big issues.
I think it's a fair question to ask, and I think the answer right now probably is probably not. I mean, one of the things that you can see is I think there is enough agreement in Congress right now, at least among the people that are trying to get a bill done, that they could actually come up with a
bipartisan group in the Senate.
Yeah, they could come up with a compromise bill. The problem is that the politics right now may well prevent that from happening. For some, this is better as an issue than it is a solution. And nobody, for many Republicans, maybe they don't want to give Biden the credit for any kind of resolution, or for some of them, maybe they just don't like the bill. But at the end of the day, the prospects of passage don't seem great.
There's House leaders have said it's dead on arrival. The House led by Republicans, Democrats right now, and slim control in the Senate, part of your reference there. We'll have to see how it plays out toward November. And again, we could talk about this for many, many broadcasts, but certainly a cornerstone issue this year. Let's talk more broadly on politics. Saw Governor Ron DeSantis once upon a time, a few weeks ago, a presidential candidate. What's the future for him likely? A lot of people are already talking 2028. Kind of analyze where he was, where he is, why he foundered, and where he goes.
Yeah, I think one of the sad truths of American politics is that, we don't even get he just ended his campaign not that long ago. We're already trying to predict his future. I'm not sure that he necessarily knows. There is a lot of talk that he could run in 2028, and I would say as a pollster, one of the things that is relatively true about him is that his support overlaps a lot with former President Trump's support. So if Trump is not on the ballot, there's pretty good reason to believe that Governor DeSantis could be a natural heir to the Trump voters, and that would make him a good candidate in 28.
At the end of the day, simply put, for all the critiques about whether he's too wooden on the trail, whether he had a tin ear at times for what the public was saying, did it simply come down to the fact that people right now, the GOP base, said, we like Donald Trump, we don't need the Trump-light version of that right now, and nobody was going to scale that mountain. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that is fair. And I think one of the truths is that when we were polling before we even really got into the race, a lot of the Trump voters did like Governor DeSantis, but they liked him secondary to President Trump. And that's a problem when you get in the race and you have to compete with President Trump. A lot of the voters might be willing to return to Ron DeSantis. There was a lot of back and forth in that race, so we'll have to see if that's true. But it was hard for him to convince Trump supporters to support him instead of Trump.
Analyze the Nikki Haley factor. I read an article as I was heading in today, talked about the fact that right now it doesn't seem like she has a way to win. If you look at polling alone, things can change. But lost Iowa, lost New Hampshire, behind in her home state of South Carolina, and yet can be a confounding, persistent factor that takes resources away from a campaign that would prefer to focus on Joe Biden. Do you see that? Do you see her as being an impediment somehow to them really having a focus and perhaps hurting Republicans in November?
Yeah, I really don't, primarily because she really needs to have a good result in South Carolina, and if she doesn't have a good result in South Carolina, it's hard to see where she's going to fundraise to continue past there. So in a lot of ways, I think this might well be the shortest Republican competitive primary, where you don't have an incumbent president that we've ever seen in the modern era.
Two questions. First, of course, size up the potential Trump-Biden rematch.
Yeah, I think it's going to look a lot like it did before. The interesting question, in American elections, because of the way that we have them designed, fundamentally there are elections in about 5 to 8 states. 8 is probably a generous assessment on that one. So then it really comes down to relatively close states like Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And in those, the early polling in those states suggests that Donald Trump is doing very well. It's a little early for me to reach too many conclusions based on that, but you're going to see a pretty intense campaign in places like Arizona, Georgia, and Michigan. And those are going to be the deciders. And anyone who says they know who's going to win, they must see the future better than the rest of us, because it's going to be competitive.
They have a crystal ball that so many others have not found. Just briefly, we hear so much talk about the concerns about democracy, on and on. But it seems to me that when you have a process now that's in many ways feels like it's almost concluded, and you're down to the general election campaign at the end of January, notwithstanding Nikki Haley still in the race. How much does that concern you and other political scientists, that we don't have a robust set of candidates in both parties, or perhaps even an independent third party right now? What does that say about where we are?
Yeah, I'm troubled by it, to be honest. The primary caucus system in the United States was not designed. It's not part of the Constitution. It wasn't something that we thought through and decided we're going to do it this way. It's a product of evolution and reforms that have occurred over the past, couple hundred years. And what it has generated is a system where early states have a disproportionately large say in who our nominees are going to be, and those states may not be representative of the larger part of the country. It is a little disappointing, I think, to many voters to go, why do we have two candidates already and I haven't even had a chance to think about who I'm going to vote for? And that is inherently problematic, but attempts to reform this usually just, there's a lot of resistance. The Democratic Party tried to move it all around and put South Carolina first, but a lot of resistance from New Hampshire, which always likes to go first. And so, changing this is going to require a concerted effort, and I'm not sure we have that in us.
And the bandwidth of efforts right now, that may not get first place. Dr. Wagner, we'll have you back for some closing thoughts in just a moment. Thanks for being with us. Stay with us.